Red Bull's engine breakthrough was supposed to dominate 2026, but now it's under investigation, and the consequences could be catastrophic. What if the most powerful team on the grid just crossed a line the FIA wasn't ready to admit even existed? In this video, you'll uncover how a single data stream triggered a full-blown FIA inquiry, why Ford may be forced to choose sides, and what this means for Red Bull's control of the next era. Because the evidence the FIA just uncovered doesn't just suggest an illegal power trick, it hints at a system Red Bull may have been perfecting for years, right under everyone's nose. Red Bull's transition into an independent engine constructor with Ford was marketed as the start of a self-sustaining empire. No more relying on Honda. No more compromises. Just total control over every horsepower, every voltage spike, every pulse of torque. But now, that very ambition has backfired. The FIA's investigation into the RB Powertrain's Ford hybrid has exposed what they call a data irregularity with potentially illegal competitive implications. Translated? The numbers don't add up, and they might reveal a hidden performance system that violates the spirit, and potentially the letter, of the 2026 power unit regulations. This is not about clerical errors. It's about a fundamental breach of trust in one of Formula One's most critical partnerships. According to senior paddock sources, the issue lies within how Red Bull's system manages energy flow from the MGU-K to the drivetrain. Under 2026 regulations, energy recovery and deployment must operate within ultra-tight tolerances, with precise limits on how energy can be harvested, stored, and released. But the FIA flagged multiple inconsistencies in Red Bull's power trace simulations, particularly during high-load acceleration zones. These spikes were too brief to violate peak power regulations explicitly, yet too frequent and consistent to be natural. It's led investigators to believe Red Bull may be using a feedback system that amplifies electric torque in microbursts that, while individually legal, collectively exceed fair deployment across a lap. What makes this even more explosive is the discovery of code-level optimization routines buried deep in the control software. Engineers from the FIA's Technical Compliance Unit have reportedly isolated segments of logic that adjust torque release dynamically, based on predictive corner profiling. This goes beyond adaptive mapping. This is machine learning-driven torque modulation. If true, it means Red Bull's 2026 unit isn't just smart. It's preemptive. It thinks ahead of the driver. And that's where the FIA is drawing a hard line. Because even if such systems aren't directly banned yet, they open up an ethical battlefield the sport is not ready to cross. The timing of this revelation couldn't be worse for Red Bull. The 2026 car design is already well underway. The chassis team, Aero Division, and ERS engineers have been working in lockstep under the assumption that this deployment strategy was stable and legal. Now, that entire foundation is shaking. If the FIA rules against Red Bull, they'll have to rewrite software architecture, recalibrate energy flow strategies, and possibly retool their engine packaging entirely. That's not just a delay, it's a strategic collapse. And while the team has the resources to recover, they may not have the time. Every other team is progressing through their final phase simulations. Red Bull could be forced back to phase 2. And then there's the Ford angle. Ford came back to Formula One for a clean, high-tech, regulation-compliant partnership. The last thing they want is to be associated with an illegal system in a hybrid era that's supposed to promote transparency and innovation. Insiders suggest there's growing friction between Ford's technical leadership and Red Bull's software division. The Americans want clarity. Red Bull wants competitive secrecy. That's not sustainable. If pressure mounts and Ford feels exposed, the partnership could fracture publicly. And that would turn this controversy from a paddock storm into a full-blown international incident between one of F1's biggest brands and one of the world's largest automakers. Meanwhile, the political dominoes are already falling. Mercedes has filed a formal request for clarification. Ferrari is said to be reviewing its own deployment architecture to ensure it doesn't inadvertently fall behind. Audi's technical chief has called for a temporary suspension of all engine homologations until the FIA delivers a ruling. It's a rare moment of near-universal agreement among rivals. If Red Bull has discovered a loophole that fundamentally alters performance balance, the sport must act before it becomes irreversible. But how do you draw a line against something that exists in gray code in milliseconds? And that leads us to the question that may define this entire saga. Is this brilliance or betrayal? Has Red Bull once again pushed the limit with genius innovation, or have they finally stepped into territory that turns Formula One into a game of legal manipulation, not racing? We've seen this tension before: double diffusers, FRIC suspensions, DAS steering, but this time, it's happening in an era where software is the battleground. And unlike physical components, code is harder to see, harder to understand, and far easier to exploit. Red Bull may have just proven that in 2026, the fastest car won't be built in wind tunnels, it'll be programmed in silence. The Verstappen camp is reportedly watching this situation with growing alarm. For a driver known for extracting every drop of performance from his machinery, stability and predictability are non-negotiables. Max has never been interested in politics, he cares about lap time, grip, and championship consistency. But when the software behind his power unit becomes a legal question mark, even he can't afford to look away. Red Bull's 2026 engine isn't just another revolution, it's the DNA of the car. If the FIA imposes new restrictions or software rewrites, the entire balance between power delivery and chassis behavior changes. And that means Max may be forced to adapt to a fundamentally different driving experience midway through development, a nightmare scenario for any elite athlete built on mechanical confidence. Within Red Bull's senior leadership, there's a scramble to contain the fallout. Helmut Marko, Christian Horner, and the Red Bull Powertrains executives have been holding high-level meetings to coordinate a legal and public relations strategy. The key internal debate? Whether to fight the FIA with a database defense or pivot to a cooperative stance that quietly rewrites the questionable software to maintain regulatory goodwill. Both strategies carry risk. A direct confrontation with the FIA could trigger penalties, scrutiny, and reputational damage. But a quiet rewrite, while safer, could mean voluntarily giving up a system that may have guaranteed Red Bull's edge in 2026. It's a rare moment where dominance and diplomacy are pulling in opposite directions. Even more concerning is the way rival teams have begun weaponizing this moment. Mercedes and Ferrari have reached out to technical working groups requesting emergency clarification on hybrid deployment protocols. These moves are not just about fair play, they're about boxing Red Bull in politically. If enough teams pressure the FIA to formalize a new rule interpretation, Red Bull may be forced to comply even without an official ruling. This would rob them of any chance to argue their case in a controlled environment. It's politics by crowd pressure, and in a sport where perception shapes policy, Red Bull's isolation is growing by the hour. The narrative is quickly turning from clever innovation to rogue operators. At Ford headquarters, the boardroom conversations are said to be far more serious than what's visible on the surface. This was supposed to be a legacy project, a triumphant return to Formula One in partnership with the most successful team of the era. But now, that legacy risks being associated with regulatory gray zones and algorithmic manipulation. Executives are reportedly demanding answers about when the questionable code was introduced, who approved it, and whether Ford engineers were ever briefed on the full deployment logic. If those answers don't arrive soon or aren't satisfactory, Ford may begin distancing its brand publicly. That would be catastrophic. Not only would Red Bull lose technical support, they'd face a reputational implosion from losing the trust of a global manufacturer on the record. The timing also couldn't be more critical. The first phase of 2026 dyno validation is scheduled to begin within weeks. This is the phase where power units are locked into integration patterns with the chassis design, cooling layout, and ERS architecture. If the FIA rules against Red Bull before or even during this phase, the entire design cycle could be frozen or invalidated. That would put Red Bull months behind their rivals at a time when aerodynamic packages are also being finalized in wind tunnels and CFD models. Unlike previous years, there is no engine supplier to blame or fallback option to lean on. Red Bull is the constructor, the innovator, and now potentially the rule breaker. And that's a load of responsibility that might prove too heavy, even for a dominant empire. Let's be clear, this isn't just a technical crisis, it's a cultural one. Red Bull has always worn its rebellious streak with pride, pushing boundaries and forcing regulators to catch up. But 2026 was meant to be a new chapter. A proof of concept that Red Bull could be more than just an aero genius. That it could dominate the era of electrification and software-defined performance. If this system is deemed illegal, it won't just be a failed component, it will be a symbolic failure of Red Bull's attempt to mature into an engine powerhouse. The trust of the paddock, the credibility of the brand, and the confidence of the driver could all be shaken at once. And now, the big question looms: what will the FIA do? In the coming weeks, they must choose between delivering a firm ruling that could redefine the engine development race or delaying for months to avoid being seen as reactionary. Either path risks backlash. And lurking in the shadows is the even greater threat, that Red Bull isn't the only team exploring these software loopholes. If that's true, this investigation may become the first domino in a chain reaction that exposes a sport-wide reckoning with the very nature of hybrid racing. Because in 2026, Formula One isn't just about speed, it's about code. And Red Bulls could be the code that rewrites everything.